Up to this point, we've been pretty much stuck in Africa. Well, there was an out of Africa, and our understanding of when our ancestors first left Africa has undergone a rather significant change since I was a graduate student. We thought that hominins didn't get out of Africa till about maybe 500,000 years ago. Now we think they got out as much as 1.8 million years ago, which is a sea change in our understanding of when our ancestors got out. Australopithecus is restricted solely to Africa. It's not found anywhere else. The earliest Homo, as we heard, was in Africa. Why did they leave Africa? It's one of the big questions. I think that curiosity is one of the great sort of aspects of being human. It's one of the things that we do. We are curious about the world. We want to know what's around the next hill or across the river or whatever. So I think that their curiosity drove them. They may have been following game, for example, particular animals that they were preying on. And when they left Africa, as I said, as much as 1.5 million years ago, or 1.8 million years ago, in fact, they had much larger bodies than Australopithecus overall. They had bodies of modern proportion. Remember, Australopithecus had relatively long arms or relatively short lower limbs. Homo, and when we left Africa, had body proportions like ours with very long lower limbs. They had larger brains, so they had a little more computing power. They probably had a broader diet, and were including now some amount of meat as well as vegetation, and probably things like tubers that they were digging up. And they began to leave Africa up through the northeastern corridor. Ernst Haeckel comes in. He was a biologist in German, a German biologist who was very much a follower of Charles Darwin. He was the proselytizer of Darwin's theory of evolution on the continent, and he wrote many books on this subject and lectured widely. He's the man who came up with the term missing link. He didn't call it exactly that, but he envisioned the discovery of a hominin that was part ape and part man. I've written here half ape, half man in 1868 when he proposed it, and he came up with the most beautiful name, Pithecanthropus, which that's the genus, which means ape man, to express that. And he put it into, he even named a species long before fossils were found, and he called it Alalus. And I don't know how good your Latin is, but that means speechless. So there you see him sitting with his assistant, getting ready to go out to do field work, as he had done in various parts of the world, and came up with this beautiful name. And he also came up with a couple of other names that we're familiar with. Ecology, for example, is one of them, and phylogeny, the evolutionary history of organisms that we talked about. And he truly did, as you can see in this illustration, he drew a tree of life. And he lists various groups of animals, and at the top, like Linnaeus, of course, are the primates, and specifically humans, and somewhere in there was Pithecanthropus alalus, speechless ape man. Well, one of the people who became interested in this subject and who was heavily influenced by Haeckel was a man by the name of Eugene Dubois. And Dubois was a Dutch physician, and he decided that he was going to go off and find the missing link. It's an interesting story that he had this passion to go to find it, and he thought that orangutans looked very much like humans in some ways, the old man of the forest, as they were called. And he decided to head off to the Dutch East Indies, and particularly to the island of Sumatra in the Malay archipelago, which of course was made so well known by Alfred Russel Wallace. And in 1887, he left all the comforts of Europe with his young wife and their child, and sailed off. He enlisted in the army and sailed off to Sumatra. And he looked around in Sumatra for quite a long time and didn't find any fossils. But he had heard that bones were being found on the island of Java, where I actually just returned from. And lo and behold, he found in 1891 a single tooth, as you see, a molar tooth, and a skull cap. And associated with that was a thigh bone. And it was a complete thigh bone. That thigh bone looks pretty weird to you, doesn't it, because of this? But that's a little bony growth. That's a little growth on the bone that ossified that way and fossilized. Well, we now know this is probably a modern human feature, a modern human femur, that it was not really associated with the skull cap. The skull cap showed very small cranial capacity of about 800, 900 cubic centimeters, very low forehead, as you can see, very restricted area behind these brow ridges, these strong brow ridges. And this was a primitive-looking skull cap. And he decided that this was Pithecanthropus. But he didn't call it Alalis, he called it Pithecanthropus, and because it walked upright, he called it Pithecanthropus erectus, erect ape man. Now, today, we call him Homo erectus. And here's the Solo River in the southeastern part of Java, where these bones were found. And this shows you his early publication of this specimen, which he called a man-like ancestor. And he was pretty excited about this. He brought the fossils back to Holland, to the Netherlands, and they're still there today, in fact, in a museum. Now, Rudolf Virchow, a German scientist, really kind of ridiculed poor Dubois. He said, this femur, something suspicious about it. I think it belongs to a gibbon. Well, he could not have been more wrong. It belongs to a modern human. But he was very influential. He wrote and spoke about it widely. And Dubois took this very seriously and very personally. And he decided, I'm done with this. He never went back to Java, interestingly. And he took his bones, his fossils, and he hid them away. And he didn't let other people see them. And between 1898 and 1922, he was totally silent about them. And then he started speaking about them again. But interesting that he was so personally hurt by this. Well, the Peking Medical, or the Peking Union Medical College, was being developed in what is today Beijing, in China. And in 1919, they were looking around for an anatomist, obviously. And the Canadian government was approached, and they sent this young man, Davidson Black. And Davidson Black went to Peking, at that time, it was called Peking, and began to develop an anatomy department. And they dissected humans, and he taught human anatomy, and so forth and so on. And he had heard about, through the Geological Survey of China, that there was a cave not far from Peking called Chukutian, which is now called Sukudian in the new spelling, and it means dragon bone hill. And they were finding dragon bones. Well, we know there are no such things as dragon bones. And they turned out, of course, to be mammal bones of various kinds of animals. But also, in the process of working there, they discovered some human bones that were clearly fossilized, such as, and is called Peking man, as you see. This is a reconstruction that we will be using quite a bit because it's a beautiful example of what we call Homo erectus. But Davidson, like Dubois, decided that it needed a new name, and he called it Sinanthropus pekinensis. Chinese man, China's Peking man is what this means. Sinanthropus, Sina meaning meaning China, and Anthropus man, and Pekinensis after Peking man. And he worked with the Geological Survey there, and they continued to collect specimens. But one morning, oh yes, by the way, the Pithecanthropus erectus from Java and the Sinanthropus pekinensis from China now have been what we call in taxonomy synonymized. They've been put into the same, and they've been put into the genus Homo, and since erectus was named before pekinensis, all these fossils are called Homo erectus. Well, unfortunately, one day when people came to the office early in the morning, they found Davidson Black hunched over, dead from a heart attack, sitting next to his fossils, and he died. So they looked around for a replacement, and they found a fabulous guy named Franz Weidenreich. And Weidenreich was German, trained anatomist, one of the best fossil describers ever, and he was sent to take Davidson Black's place. And off he went to Beijing. And by the time Japan invaded China in 1936, they had assembled 40 individuals of Homo erectus, a whole series of skulls, a whole series of long bones, a whole series, arms and legs, a whole series of lower jaws and teeth. And in 1941, right after Pearl Harbor, it was realized that it was time, Weidenreich realized it was time to leave China. These fossils were endangered, he was endangered, so he had them all packed up, put on a train, sent to the China Sea where they were to get on the USS Harrison. The USS Harrison was sunk somewhere in the China Sea, and the records indicate that those fossils never made it on to the ship. So they were lost somewhere between Peking and the South China Sea, and they have never been found. Fortunately, Weidenreich made casts of these, plaster casts of everything that he studied. And not only that, he wrote these extensive, in detail descriptions of every single fossil. There was one book on the teeth, one book on the skulls, one book on the mandibles, and so on. So fortunately, there was a scholar, and here you see him almost embracing these Peking man fossils and some comparative modern material, modern humans, but it was because of his extraordinary abilities to describe, photograph, draw, and publish these that we have records. Now, today in China, the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology in Beijing continues to do work at Zhoukoudian. And they have found additional pieces of skulls that fit on to casts that Weidenreich had made. And new fossils are being found all the time. In fact, in the countryside around China, there have been a number of skulls of Homo erectus and other fossils that continue to be found. Well, in 1930, interesting, as I said, Dubois never made it back to Java, but another German, interestingly, like Weidenreich, by the name of von Königswald, it's a fabulous name, it means of the king's forest, and he was always called Ralph. Ralph was that was the R in his initials that you see here. And I knew Ralph over the years and would visit him regularly in Frankfurt, where he had an absolutely wonderful laboratory and some original fossils from Java and elsewhere. And he too had learned of dragon bones. So he went to Chinese apothecary stores, drug stores in South China, and there were some in Indonesia also, and he had an actual prescription for some ailment. Because as you can see, the Chinese believed that that certain bones, and in fact dragon bones, which are mammal bones, were important medicines. It could cure backaches, headaches, other illnesses, and so on. And he went around with this prescription and collected bones beginning in the 1930s. And he began excavating in Java in a number of places and is responsible for the discovery of quite a number of fossils. He was interred by the Japanese during the Second World War. He carefully hid those Javanese fossils, which made it through, which is very fortunate for all of us. So there were victims of Homo erectus. Davidson Black succumbed to a heart attack. Eugene Dubois was ridiculed. And Weidenreich is sometimes called the man who lost the fossils, but he really didn't. If it had not been for him, those fossils would have been gone forever, and all that information would have been lost. And in the next presentation, we're going to look at the anatomy of Homo erectus.